This is the Human Action Podcast with your host, Jeff Deist.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. I'm traveling in Texas this week, and our great friend, my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy, is busy, along with his wife, Kellyanne, welcoming a brand new baby into their home. They needed a little bit of time. So the show this week consists of a conversation I recently had with a great friend of mine, Chris Casey, who is a principal at WindRock Wealth Management in Chicago, Illinois. And we did a deep dive on this upcoming week's midterm elections in the context, the broader context of both the political and economic landscape in this country, including the specter of the 2024 presidential election, whether that involves Trump or Ron DeSantis or the failing Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever it might be, and whether or not the midterms will have much to tell us about whether, in fact, social issues, so-called, will continue to dominate our headlines, or whether the American people will be thinking more about the economy as they suffer under huge amounts of inflation and uncertainty and dollar degradation. So this is a great conversation, a deep political, economic, sociological analysis of what's happening in the United States. Chris is not only a great friend, but a great interviewer, and we're sure you'll enjoy it. So stay tuned.
This is Chris Casey, Managing Director at WindRock Wealth Management. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Jeff Deist, President of the Mises Institute and well-known writer and speaker. Jeff, thanks for joining us today. Good
morning, Chris. Good to be with you.
So 2 years ago, we did a podcast where we talked about the elections. I remember remarking, both of us were commenting on how amazing it was that Trump or the Republicans were in it at all, right? Like, so how are they not down 20 percentage points with everything going wrong that could possibly go wrong? And now I almost feel like it's the exact reverse, right? It's how can the Democrats be in any race? How are they not down 20 points across the board? Do you agree with that? And what do you kind of attribute that to?
Well, I do agree with it. With the Trump phenomenon 2 years ago, there was this idea of the shy voter who doesn't really announce that he or she is unhappy with the left or with the progressive orthodoxy and was going to vote for Trump because that was the kind of thing that might make you unpopular with your friends or your social circle or at church or at work or something. So there were a lot of these sort of quiet Trump voters, and they may not have. And in fact, many of them did not particularly like Trump or care for Trump, but just viewed him as an alternative to this progressive juggernaut, the Hillarys and now the Bidens. And here, this time around, you don't have that. If the shy voter, there's no shy Democrats. people who are voting for the Democrats, despite all the problems in this country, I think are pretty open about it and pretty arrogant about it, actually. And I think the short answer as to why Democrats aren't completely out of it is because they're skillful using their friends in the media to promote, I guess, what we can call social issues. In other words, they want this election to be a referendum on Donald Trump's fascist, Nazi authoritarianism, although Donald Trump is no longer in office. They want this to be a referendum on things like abortion and trans and guns, all of which I would personally view as exceedingly minor issues. I know other people disagree with that, but nonetheless, relative to the big questions of war and peace, the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. entitlement debacle, I think those are very, very, very serious problems which stand to affect us all far more on a day-to-day basis personally in terms of, whether we are more impoverished going forward than we are today. So I hate to see this social issue stuff dominate, but let's face it, that's more interesting and more fun to people to talk about and debate. Abortion, for example, people would much rather talk about abortion than talk about what the Fed's been doing since 2008. It's just a fact. And so elections aren't won or lost on logical debate. They aren't won or lost on appeals to reason and sort of rational discussions of the facts. They're won and lost on emotion and tribalism. Nothing new about that. But here we are. I mean, Joe Biden is so clearly unfit to do anything other than go into a retirement home. And that's no knock on him. It's just father time. The Democrats in both the House and the Senate are clearly just almost deranged, beholden to the worst of their left progressive constituencies. And I mean the worst. I mean people who obsess about gender and things like that, and who were horrible with COVID. And as far as the Republicans go, they just don't provide a good or coherent alternative. They don't know how to talk about property and markets. They don't know how to talk about opportunity versus dependency, about ownership versus welfarism. All these things that at least you and I would say are pretty easy to talk about. But they don't do that, or at least they don't do that well. And I think part of the reason is they just don't believe it. I mean, at the end of the day, they're more of a corporatist party, and they're not very good on foreign policy from my perspective. And so the difference between not conservatives and liberals in this country, but between Democratic and Republican nationally elected officials is actually pretty small. And so I think that's what keeps the Democrats in this. I'm not convinced of a red wave on this coming Tuesday. I don't know when this will air, but nonetheless, I'm not 100% convinced, especially with respect to some of these governorships and Senate seats. The Republicans will probably win the House, but that's not really, to me, nearly as important as governorships.
Yeah, and some of these social issues you talked about, the ones that are directly relevant. I'll give you an example in Illinois. How about just personal safety? It's crazy what's going on here as far as the amount of crime. And now on January 1st, they're enacting what they call no cash bail, which really means no bail, meaning they just release people for really heinous crimes. And I've personally spoken to lieutenants in the Chicago Police Department who man the downtown area, and the amount of crime is just skyrocketing. No one wants that post because it's awful. So the social issues that are relevant aren't even being really discussed, at least in the appropriate forum. It's like it's all taken a back burner to what you mentioned is fairly minor as it relates to a daily direct impact on people, issues like abortion.
Well, and of course, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, for example, simply denies that this is even happening. The Twitterati say, well, the murder rates are actually higher in these red states. And of course, what they mean is the deep blue cities within these red states. So yeah, when you look at red state murder rates, if you include Miami, if you include Atlanta, if you include Memphis, if you include New Orleans, if you include Birmingham, Montgomery, Alabama, this is the trickery to try to make people not believe what's so obviously in front of their face. And people do care an awful lot about safety and law and order. And that might take the form of a shy voter, especially moms, for example, voting against the Lori Lightfoots of the world. But it is pretty amazing how the left just tries to openly deny what people see in front of them. I mean, look at the homeless situation. It's probably the worst it's ever been in this country, a supposedly rich country. If you go to Los Angeles, it's pretty remarkable, but it's not just Los Angeles. I mean, you can go to Portland and Seattle. You can go south of Los Angeles, Orange County and San Diego County, which used to be pretty tidy places, have huge encampments, huge villages. I was in Hawaii a couple of years ago, and Honolulu has vast numbers, an army of homeless people. And of course, some of this we can understand simply because the warmer places are more likely to have homeless because you can survive there. It's awfully tough to be homeless throughout winter in Chicago. But the fact that we can't grapple with these things, I think, is a matter. It's a failure of will. And a political failure. It's not that we couldn't figure it out and use some tax money, with some tough love to build some dormitory style places and impose rules on people dealing with drug abuse and mental health, and they'd be forced to work and this sort of thing. But we just lack the political will. And there's an awful lot of homeless people. Talk about social issues, homelessness. There's an awful lot of homeless people who are simply retreatists, who don't want to be part of a 9-to-5 job or family life or or have rent and utilities or any of these basic things. And so they find it more amenable to live on the streets, given the matrix of services and free stuff which is available to them. I'm not saying it's a good life, but they can get disability. Oftentimes they can get Social Security, they can get food stamps, AFDC, that sort of thing. And so they just prefer it. And you can ask homeless people, and they say, "No, I don't want to be in a shelter with a bunch of rules. I want to be out here using because I'm an addict, and I want to use whatever substance I use." So it's not that we don't have the sort of logistical or financial ability to deal with the homeless. We just lack the will. There was a time in American history where a homeless person would have been very harshly dealt with by a cop and forced to move along. And we just can't or won't do that anymore. And so it really is something, the way elections now shake out. And we don't talk about virtually anything important, and we talk ad nauseum about all kinds of unimportant things. And for people who listen to your show, for people who are, have some wealth to manage, for people who are worried about their investments, I mean, this is pretty important stuff. I mean, what's going on with the dollar is no joke. And if we don't get out in front of this, we're going to find that our kids and grandkids are really facing something, a significant decline in the American standard of living. And so all of us who are fortunate enough to have reached a certain age and to have grown up in the West, and as a result of that, not so much through our own efforts or brilliance, but the result of previous generations, had a pretty nice material standard of living, I think we have an obligation to those future generations. And what I really hate about elections and politics in general in this country is how much they're just focused on the current time period, how they encourage us to want free stuff today at the expense of tomorrow. That to me is a tragedy.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I was bike riding a couple weeks ago, and I remember I was at this junction, which was like at a kind of close to a homeless shelter. And there was a guy like kind of standing on the sidewalk next to me who literally had a nicer bike and a nicer phone than me, and he was homeless. So I was like, I'm doing something wrong. So let's assume that there is no, overwhelming red wave. And in fact, the Republicans, just capture the House. Maybe the Senate remains tied, or maybe they don't capture, or maybe they lose it completely, even without a tie. Do you see anything changing? Meaning, will it effectively block any kind of dangerous progressive agenda, or do you see any benefits, whether it's, for instance, hearings on particular matters or investigations?
I think there's minor benefit in the sense that we should generally support divided government, and we should generally support the thwarting of the Biden administration's agenda. And if you look at these people, I mean, what's really changed in Washington is not so much just the ideological tenor, but the fact that there's really deeply unserious people involved in presidential administrations and executive agencies. I mean, true ideologues, people who are unhinged from reality, people with agendas that are so uneconomic, agendas that just absolutely don't comport with human nature, that I think has changed. That's far more important than the old liberal conservative divide, is this sort of reasonable grounded in reality versus unreasonable grounded in utopian thinking. So if some of the people around Joe Biden are so wildly to the left of this image people had of him as this sort of old corporate senator from Delaware and someone who's been in DC forever, and we can trust him and he's not a radical and this and that. Well, I mean, maybe he's not, but the people around him sure are. So yes, I think there's some benefit in the Republicans just having the House, for example, or the Senate in terms of thwarting that. But I don't see a lot of upside, because we've seen this movie before where the Republicans have 2 or even 3 branches of government in the early 2000s when George W. Bush was president. The Republicans had the House and the Senate. What did we get out of that period? Well, we got 2 disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We got Medicare Part D which, by the way, the prescription drug benefit costs more in actuarial terms over time than the original Medicare, the office visits. The drugs cost more than the office visits. So that was an absolute time bomb created by Republicans in charge. We got the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act, which are, the latter is clearly going to be used against so-called MAGA white supremacists, fascist nationalists, whatever terms we're using now for people right to the right of Mitt Romney. And so I don't have a lot of faith there. I think that Republicans in general, if you look at Mitch McConnell, if you look at House Minority Leader McCarthy, I mean, these are people who are simply get along people who want to run things, perhaps in the House and Senate, but that doesn't mean that they really view the world much differently than Hillary Clinton does, or that Mitt Romney does, or Liz Cheney does. So I don't have a lot of faith there. Where I find things far more interesting and hopeful and optimistic is at the state and local level, because I think some incredible things are happening there. Some of your listeners might be familiar with Hans Hoppe, and he's written quite a bit about the dissolution of big sclerotic Western states into smaller parts and constituencies as something that is may well happen in the future. And that's the opposite trend. If we look at especially the 20th, but also the 19th and 20th century were about Europe going from all kinds of small principalities and dukedoms and smaller states into these bigger mega states that we have today. And of course, we have the EU and the United States also during those same 2 centuries went from sort of these 50 states in a republic with a smaller federal government into basically the states becoming just glorified counties of the federal government in DC. So those centralizing political trends, those dominated the 19th and 20th century. Political centralization was the story in politics. But in the 21st, if Hans Hoppe is right, and I certainly hope he is, we may see a decentralizing impulse. And we've gotten some great glimpses of that during the COVID crisis, where we had a lot of people voting with their feet. We had a great relocation happening within this country, away from the more draconian COVID lockdown states towards the states that were more open for business, for school, for whatever it might be. And we saw a lot of crazy housing prices as a result of that. We saw governors asserting their own authority over their state's COVID rules, as opposed to having that come out of DC or the CDC or even internationally, the World Health Organization. And we saw a lot of countries around the world also not go with the international consensus and apply their own more localized approaches to COVID. So I think that was a very healthy thing. And so we have what was already starting in America before COVID was that the population was aging. The number of people over 65 is set to double by 2050. Older people in general, not always, but in general, they tend to leave colder climes because it's difficult to deal with 4 feet of snow when you're 80. So the Northeast places, and also places like Cleveland and Chicago and Minneapolis and Midwest, these areas were losing population relative to the Phoenixes and the Austins and the Orlando, Tampa, Floridas. So that was already happening sort of as a natural demographic shift of older people moving towards warmer climes. But I think it's really accelerated. And so now when we talk about New York City, I don't think of it in nearly the same way I used to. I don't want to go to Broadway play there. And, I have no desire now to visit. I used to visit several times a year. So that's, that sort of thing where the new America is along the southern half of, or where the energy is in the new America, certainly in the southern half of the country. And so that has a really profound effect on politics, because especially the northeastern part of the United States was like, for lack of a better term, more left-wing, more liberal, more democratic. And as it loses influence and resonance to the southern states, I mean, what Democrats were counting on, Chris, absolutely article of faith, prior to Hillary Clinton's incredible upset loss to Donald Trump, was that there was an inexorable, inevitable demographic shift happening that could not be stopped, which was going to turn Texas blue and which was going to turn Florida blue. forever and ever. And then in the Electoral College, the Republicans could never again win a national election, and that we would have the Democratic Party in charge of this country. At least at the national level, there would be holdout red states like Nebraska or something like that, but Democrats would dominate. And so when the COVID Great Migration happened, it appears we don't have really good data yet. I mean, this midterm will provide some data, but it appears by voter registration that both Texas and Florida have become redder since COVID. Now, and if that's true, because remember, Ron DeSantis barely beat that Gillum guy. Double, they had to count it later, and then it was just a few thousand votes or something. And now, if he wins handily this fall for the governorship of Florida, and wildly exceeds that margin, and that proves in a sense that Florida's become redder. I mean, that shift is going to drive a stake into the heart of the left-wing psyche in this country, because they were counting on Texas and Florida through migration domestically, but also immigration, to become blue states forever. And to have that challenge, maybe just paused or slowed, but maybe even reversed, that to me is pretty profound in its implications for national politics in this country. I mean, there's more deplorables than they thought, and they're living longer than they thought. And we see this in Europe too. How do you think this lady wins in Italy? Well, I mean, people from her party took enough seats to coalesce with other parties, similar parties, and make her president or prime minister. Sorry, I forget which they have in Italy. How did Brexit happen? How does Viktor Orban continue to have pretty large Democratic majority support in Hungary? What's happening in Poland? It's just interesting that this sense of inevitability that the Hillary Clinton, sort of the globalist neoliberals had, that history has an arc, it's progressive, we're always getting better, just like the Whig theory. And of course, Hillary Clinton's the next president of the United States. We're finally going to have our first female president. She's super qualified. This is gigantic feminist victory, a long time coming. And then it didn't happen. And that's pretty remarkable. And maybe we'll see, but maybe this midterm will be not as big as that, but will be a further sign that some of these things that our left-wing friends imagine were inevitable actually aren't.
Yeah. To your point about the increased assertion of states, their authority vis-a-vis the federal government, I always say that one of the two greatest things Trump ever did, one is just the appointments up and down throughout the judiciary, and kind of remaking that whole branch. But on top of that, and I doubt this was for philosophical reasons, I'm sure it was just kind of cover his butt, it was more of a political expediency, was really passing on the lockdowns to the states. And it's only because of that we have someone like DeSantis and some of the others that were able to stand up, and then building on that, assert other states' authority. So, looking forward to the next election, because this all kind of ties in with what you're talking about. How do you see it playing out? In particular, someone like DeSantis, who's built up a pretty nice following, with kind of the lingering specter of Trump running, whether or not he will. How do you see those two, I guess, potential rivals even playing out?
Well, I wish Trump would see the wisdom in stepping back. I mean, he's way too old, and he engenders way too much animosity on the left. I mean, he really exercises the left as a boogeyman. So he could actually wield a lot of power by sort of staying out of it, but not officially announcing whether he's in or out, and being someone who supports DeSantis, who is not only far younger, but far more disciplined. I mean, Ron DeSantis is, relative to Trump, the people he surrounds himself with, the way he thinks about things, the way he operates is so much more disciplined and rational. Bob Woodward wrote a book called Fear, which is about the Trump years in the White House. And Bob Woodward's a big critic of Trump. But nonetheless, if you read that book, I mean, it's pretty remarkable the way Trump would surround himself with sycophants. He would play them against each other. So rather than trying to come up with the best course of action, they'd all be trying to win favor with the boss. And then he installs his own daughter and son-in-law into these quasi roles where they have their own little cubby offices right off the Oval Office, but they don't have an official position within the administration. So it's both nepotist but also fraught because Ivanka and Jared, or Ivana, I forget, are sort of working crosswise against him and some of his cabinet. And then on top of it all, when you read Bob Woodward's book, you find that there was just open insubordination by his own department and agency chiefs. I mean, it was really remarkable. You have to go back to, let's say, JFK, with LBJ sort of undermining him by going to Vietnam and promising lots more troops. I mean, there was plain insubordination under Trump. His Joint Chiefs, his CIA, his Pentagon people, his own cabinet members. He would leave a meeting saying, "No, I don't want that. I want less in Afghanistan," and he would leave the meeting and they would just laugh and say, "No, we're not doing that," quite openly. I mean, this is what Bob Woodward has chronicled. And of course, he's doing this through testimony. I'm not saying it's all 100% true, but I believe that the thrust of it is true. And so you begin to say, well, what the hell difference does it make, Chris, who we elect? Because this deep state, for lack of a better term, the administrative agencies, they're pretty open. They're not deep. They really do operate independently of a president. Presidents come and go. They just do what they want. And you look at that and you think, is that going to be any better if we have some bruising Trump reelection bid? He's going to be close to 80 years old or however old he is. He's not super skinny guy. I mean, it's too much. And his ego is so vast that it clouded his judgment. He surrounded himself with people like John Bolton, who immediately started working to undermine him. I mean, his desire to be flattered is just off the charts. It's just almost unbelievable. I mean, lots of politicians have egos, but this guy, it really is something different. And so it made him unserious and unworkable in the office. And DeSantis has a much more cool demeanor, much more workmanlike, thinks steps ahead, very reticent on social media. He lets his staff do that stuff in their own names. I mean, there's just a million ways where he's vastly superior. Great wife and family, a great success story you can point to in Florida during COVID. I mean, this is someone with, Trump's business successes are pretty checkered at best, whereas DeSantis can point to, in my opinion, lots of people hate Florida, but in my opinion, real executive success during COVID in terms of not having any greater death or infection, infection death rates than any other part of the country, despite having tons of retirees, but yet having much better outcomes with respect to business closures and school closures and normal life and happiness and having people relocate there, people with money. I mean, if you look at states that are losing, like California, it's not just the numbers. I mean, the numbers aren't that dramatic. In terms of a percentage, you say, well, okay, California lost X 100,000 people last year net relative to immigrants, and that's only 1% of the California population. Well, that's entirely true. The problem, and Florida gained, but only 1% of the net of the population. That's true on both ends, but it's the identity of that 1%. The top few percent in California pay just an astounding amount of the state income taxes because a lot of it's capital gains. And so, it's even more skewed than it is with federal tax receipts. California state tax receipts are unbelievably skewed. They're paid by just a small percentage of the very top earners. And so when those people leave, whether they're just going across the border to Incline Village, Nevada, or whether they're going all the way to Tampa, Florida, I mean, that's a very painful loss. Those are the sheep who have been paying for everything in California. So it really is something that I think DeSantis can hang his hat on. And I really, I'm not a big voter, to be fair, and I don't consider myself a Republican, to be fair. I consider myself a realist who sees the left for what it is and how unhinged how separated from reality it is, and is just trying to be rational about the defensive measures we can take, in terms of my own children and maybe someday grandchildren. So that's my kind of pragmatic, hard-boiled thinking, which is that not only is DeSantis a much better candidate for all the reasons I mentioned, but also much more likely to win. I think Trump loses to Biden, or even, I don't know about Kamala Harris or whoever might be the candidate if it's not Biden. But I honestly believe that Trump does worse in total votes a second time around. I think people have really soured on him, and I certainly did with his. I don't agree with his fast tracking the mRNA vaccines amongst a tiny handful of cronyist, patent protected, liability immune pharma companies. I don't like pharma companies, and I don't think they really have our best interests. So for all those reasons, I mean, I really think DeSantis ought to be the nominee, and if the GOP can't quash Trump because he's just such a cult of personality. I mean, he's the kind of guy who would just go run independent or something. I mean, he just can't not be flattered. And in that sense, he's far more like Hillary Clinton than unlike. They both have this sort of deep-seated or atavistic need to be proven correct. So in that weird way, I'll connect him to Hillary. So boy, oh boy, I wish to hell, Chris, my personal opinion is that he would just care more about the country than his ego this time around.
Yeah, it never even occurred to me, but I could see that if he went independent. I guess the only thing that perhaps would stop him from running either way may be his true deep-seated belief that they will, in his mind, rig the election and prevent him from winning. That because he doesn't want to be humiliated twice.
Or they'll threaten him and his family with further civil or criminal prosecutions, whether that's federal or in New York State or whatever. In other words, say, listen, if you don't give this up, because they're scared of him. I mean, let's be honest. They're scared of what he represents and what he touches in the American people, which is a populist uprising. They're very, very scared of that. And they want him to be destroyed. And so one thing they could do is just say, listen, we are going to bankrupt you. And Melania and Barron and your family are going to be in penury, and you may well be in jail if you don't cool your jets. We're going to charge you, and the January 6th committee may charge him regardless, but prophylactically trying to cut him off from running. But the fact that they're still so hung up on Trump shows you that they're absolutely terrified of him.
Yeah, well, the person I'm terrified of is Jill Biden, because I can't imagine any spouse allowing the other one to proceed forward with a candidacy when they clearly have capacity issues, right? But so blinded by power, she obviously wants him to be president. Do you think, though, that given what we've seen over the last couple of years, that maybe with the next election, or she will sit him down, or maybe the power brokers or other close confidants, and say, listen, you really can't move forward, whether it's because they're concerned about him or they just want someone else for other reasons? Do you think that will happen, or do you think he will run in 2024?
I think he won't, but I don't think it'll be about concern for his health. I mean, Jill Biden, come on. I mean, that woman has been at his side, and he has not been at the sort of nice, clean character he's been portrayed as, to put it mildly. He's a pretty bad guy. And look at this Fetterman candidate in Pennsylvania who had a stroke. I mean, where's his family? The idea that he should be amongst the rarest of rarities in the United States, one of 100 U.S. senators, I mean, is so preposterous. And to be fair, I don't think Herschel Walker or Raphael Warnock have any business being U.S. senators in terms of their abilities. A U.S. senator should be in the top 1% of all Americans in terms of intelligence, demonstrated ability and aptitude, achievements, character, judgment, temperament. They shouldn't be elected by popular vote. They should be appointed by state legislatures. They shouldn't be representative of anything but states, not of voters. I mean, the whole thing is just so fraught. They shouldn't come from the U.S. House. They should generally be, a tremendous cut above U.S. House members And they used to be more Ivy League, more wealthy, et cetera. But now you just get these absolute hacks. And so, the fact that John Fetterman, is that his first name, could even sniff the U.S. Senate, I mean, is just such an indictment of our system. And nobody wants to do this now. I mean, you almost have to be Mitt Romney and be really wealthy to even put up with it. But it really is something. I mean, Raphael Warnock is a crazed left-wing hate monger. He's like a hate preacher against white people. Herschel Walker is, by all accounts, kind of a dopey guy, a sweet guy, obviously a football star, but I mean, he has just terrible personal peccadillos and not very articulate. He can't really speak well. I mean, the U.S. Senate ought to be a place. Wow, and then you look at the presidency, and that ought to be even a step above that. So I don't think Biden will be the nominee. He certainly won't be if this coming Tuesday goes badly for Democrats. That'll be the end of him, and they'll start patting him on the head. And what you'll see, and we've already seen this to an extent, but you'll see friendly outlets start to come out with these ambushes against Biden, start to question his health, come up with things because they'll want to bury him. And so there will be political dirty tricks now against Biden to make sure he gets the message, hey, you're not running again. Now, who does that leave them? I don't think Kamala is a viable candidate. She didn't win a single primary. She didn't get a single electoral college vote. I think Gavin Newsom in California, I mean, he certainly could rehabilitate himself between now and then. I think his actions during COVID, he had that, I don't want to call it a scandal, but just exposure when he was at that French Laundry restaurant, which happens to be this $600 a plate kind of place where he wasn't wearing his mask. But he's also got a pretty embarrassing press conference in his past where he admitted to some marital affair or something. I don't really exactly remember what it was, but so I think, he's somewhat damaged goods. Obviously, Cuomo in New York is no longer a viable candidate. And as for these senators that the Democrats might want to run, like Amy Klobuchar, people don't like senators for president. They haven't had a lot of them. And they haven't done all that well. I mean, if you look at, obviously, Ted Kennedy was a lion of the Senate and couldn't manage to get across the finish line. That's pretty. Mitt Romney, he became senator after, but there's just something about senators where we view them as kind of these genteel types. Obviously, some have made it to the presidency, but people like governors a lot more because of the analogy. Well, it's experience, it's an executive position, especially when you're from a big state like Florida. So, I think the Democratic bench is pretty soft.
What about Pritzker? It's amazing that I would even bring him up because, as far as I can tell, everything he's done has been a disaster. But I think I've underestimated him, Pritzker being the governor out of Illinois, in that fact of, he doesn't look like a particularly bright or savvy guy. And yet I think politically he may be, because it seems like he's done some really smart political moves. I think he's clearly interested in the presidency.
Well, it's wide open. I think Trump's very beatable. And I don't think, no matter how much you hate D.C. or the status quo, I don't think the majority of Americans are ready for Trump Part 2. It's just too much. There's just a fatigue there with this guy. And so that means that DeSantis ought to be the front runner if we had a rational GOP. So if you're a Democrat and you're looking at that, I mean, you need a big name. You're scared of DeSantis. You're even a little scared of Trump. So I don't think a Pritzker. I think they need, a Hillary Clinton. I would absolutely not count her out. She has lived her whole life feeling that she deserves to be president. There is a burning hole within her. She is obviously a psychopath, and psychopaths don't take social cues very well, including social cues where you lost 2 elections. Right? I mean, that by definition, psychopaths are unconcerned with the feelings or thoughts of others. So I wouldn't put it past Hillary Clinton. I wouldn't put it past Michelle Obama. I wouldn't put it past a lot of people. I think, we forget it wasn't that long ago. There were something like 10 or 12 Republicans on the stage. You had Mitt Romney. You had Ted Cruz. And Ted Cruz is kind of a son of a bitch, but say what you will. I mean, Alan Dershowitz would tell you he was a brilliant law student. I mean, he's very hacky. in his public persona, but he's a smart guy. He's actually a capable guy. You had Rand Paul. You had that Scott Walker governor guy from Wisconsin, who was kind of a Koch favored guy. I mean, you had Mike Huckabee. You had Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania. Those two were sort of more the Christian conservative end. I mean, you had a pretty big slate of candidates. Michelle, oh gosh, I can't remember her last name. The former congresswoman. So you had a pretty big
Bachmann.
range of candidates. Yeah, Michelle Bachmann, right? And you know, I would suspect that if the Democrats were smart, they would want to do something like that. I mean, don't just select Gavin Newsom and then find out that California is actually deeply unpopular. Just the idea of a California governor is deeply unpopular in swing states. But we're going to find out a lot more on Tuesday, because states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Georgia, if Georgia turns blue with this Stacey Abrams woman, and if Raphael Warnock beats Herschel Walker, both of which are very possible, then, Georgia's a huge state with a lot of electoral college votes. I mean, that's going to be, you got to look at these sort of swing states. Nevada, is Nevada actually going to elect a Republican to statewide office, which they haven't done in quite a while, with Laxalt? That's going to be interesting. But I don't know. I think the Democrats are going to need a big name to overcome, because Trump and DeSantis are brand names. They are established brands. Hillary Clinton's an established brand, but the rest of them really aren't. And just that brand thing is huge in politics. It's pretty remarkable. But at this point, again, from a self-defensive posture, I gotta hope it's DeSantis.
Well, Jeff, this is great. I really appreciate your time. Obviously, people can find your writings and follow you on at the Mises Institute. What's your Twitter handle? Because I know you're very active on there as well.
My Twitter is at Jeff Deist, JEFFDEIST. It brings me no joy, but somehow I can't resist.
How are you not banned?
I just can't resist it. It's not good. It's like eating. It's like opening a box of chocolates and having 10 of them. It's like, I should just have 2.
Well, Jeff, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.